Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kuang, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. Today's guest is award-winning writer and editor Erika W. Smith, who has been working in the media industry for over a decade, covering the latest in topics such as sex and relationships, entertainment, travel, and astrology. She'd previously held staff positions at Cosmopolitan, Refinery 29, Bust Magazine, with additional writing published at Vice, Allure, and Vulture. In this conversation, Erika shares some of her insights and experiences as a contemporary working writer, from pitching in the newsroom to traditional publishing and ghostwriting. You can find more side-by-side conversations at sidebysidepodcast.podbean.com. And if you'd like to connect with me about my services, please visit www.robertquanhome.com. So it's been a minute for me personally to be connecting and catching up with people through the podcast. Really happy to be catching up with my friend Erika Smith. And we've known each other for quite a long time. In fact, I don't really remember how we met, probably just through mutuals and stuff.
Yeah, I remember hanging out with you and Ari at Maya's apartment when she lived in Bushwick.
Yeah.
So I think I met you just through Maya at some point when she lived there, which I think was 2014 through 2017. So somewhere in that little window.
No, it's so funny. And all that time, I knew you're also a writer and a journalist and all of that. So I was always like, oh yeah, we have that in common. And we were just mostly like friends. So I feel like this is the first time I get to like dive in about you, your work / career, even though, I mean, I don't think those are things that we just talk about all the time when we're just like hanging out. So this is kind of fun for me too. I always joke that you're one of the people I know who went to school for journalism and then became a journalist. I laugh to myself because I'm just like, well, that's the way it should be. But I actually feel like that's not always the case. So I'm curious how you really found this path for yourself and decided to study it.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like a lot of journalists, they learn on the job. They don't learn through J school. So like, don't spend that money if you don't need to. But I kind of entered college just wanting to do more writing and really focus on writing. And I wasn't thinking about journalism specifically. I was always like a really big reader and a really big writer, writing my own little short stories and lots of fan fiction, things like that. So I actually entered college as an English major, and I double majored in English and journalism. But the English major type of writing is very like academic and very analytical, and I wanted something a lot more conversational and a lot more informal. So I took a couple classes in the journalism school that counted for both, and I really liked them. So then I just like kept taking more and decided to double major in English literature and journalism, which is kind of like two very writing focused majors, but they were very different types of writing.
That's true.
Yeah. So sometimes I'm like, maybe I should have picked up a different skill set, but I had a good time. And I feel like there are a lot of ways to learn journalism. You don't have to go to J school. You can learn through experience. But I think the experience I did have did really help me prepare for the journalism world and give me some confidence in that area.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, you can make the decision to be like, I want to write, professionally. And I think technically anyone can get started. You just have to like do it a lot. But
yeah,
I think having that structure is help. Like I went to school for writing as well, as you know, a different medium. But like I wound up looking for jobs that were closer to like the journalistic field, although I'm sure that's debatable after school. So I think that's very much a practical way of considering how to apply your writing skills. If you just have that talent, we all have to make those decisions. There are sort of like stereotypes about English majors and J school. You got to experience both. How are they different in terms of style or even just how the work is approached?
Journalism, and especially the one I went to at Boston University, was very like practical and very focused on like working similar to a real newsroom. And the program I was in at the time, like you could submit your stories to be published for real. And I had several stories published that way in the Boston Globe digital website at the time. So it was very focused on like real hands on reporting. We were each assigned different areas. So I was reporting on Somerville for a while. So it felt very like hands on, gain through experience, do a lot of writing. And then we also did a lot of reading and picking apart the articles and saying what was done well, what was done poorly.
Right, right, right.
And those were all things that were published, you know, within the past year and within the past couple years, which kind of gave me the confidence too that I could like pick up like an issue of the New York Times or the New Yorker and be like, this piece was done very well, this piece was not done very well, even though it was like a fancy publication.
Yeah, yeah. That's pretty valuable too. And you get to
Yeah.
hear different people's response to the same writing,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah,
like very school. It's like a thing that school offers you that I think is pretty valuable.
for sure. Yeah. And then the English major, obviously, all the texts were generally much older, like sometimes hundreds of years older. And it was much more analytical and much more academic. So it was more like you're writing for a very niche audience. Where with journalism, you want a lot of people to understand you. So you're writing for like a wide audience, where with an English major paper, you're like writing really just for your professor or maybe for like your professor and a handful of other
Yeah.
professors. It's not something that you are hoping to reach as many people as possible. And I also feel like in academic writing, it's kind of rewarded to be like very verbose and very like obtuse, where like the goal is to kind of have the average person like not understand what you're talking about.
Hmm.
Where with journalism, the opposite is true, where you want to kind of communicate clearly and reach a lot of people. So it's very different types of writing.
Journalism and communications have a lot more in common to me as far as like things that are important that you need to work on and skill sets that if you're writing like a novel, it may or may not apply. I definitely feel like having to turn things around and make sure you get the information down succinctly and quickly and learning to filter information. So we're probably going to talk about it, but the media literacy part, I felt like came from actually reading a bunch of different pieces, smaller pieces. Yeah, I really appreciate journalistic skills now more than ever because we do have to rely on it. However, I think news, where we get news, has changed a lot and how it's
Absolutely.
dispensed, how it's shared, and there's a lot going on in the landscape. So, given that you've had so much intimate experience having to navigate all of that as it's evolved from, J school times, what's been your experience just overall?
With like media literacy or
And also just the fact that we get news not necessarily from reading these pieces that journalists work on, but it could be from TikTok, like we talked about, and
yeah.
things like that. So, like, how have journalists like yourself tried to think about these things and like navigate that?
So I think it is something that is still very much in flux, where we see there's been a lot of writing about kind of the role of the journalist as influencer and how a lot of journalists now really have to promote themselves as kind of like a public personality figure, whether that's like filming videos on TikTok or, just like really heavily promoting their work on Twitter. I think in a lot of newsrooms, like your personal following on social media is a big factor in hiring decisions and things like that. That's not something that I love, but I think it is a reality of the business right now where you have to be really self promotional for yourself as like a influencer and yourself as like creator, especially if you're freelance, where I think traditionally, and there are still a few people who work this way, journalists, and it's not every journalist, but a lot of journalists, especially editors, were a more behind the scenes role where
Right.
there are always exceptions. Like there's always like a Joan Didion who's getting photographed for Vogue.
Yeah.
But a lot of journalists and editors, like you might know their work, but you wouldn't know their names and you certainly wouldn't know their faces. Where now I think there's the expectation that you should be putting your name and especially your face out everywhere with your work.
I very much agree with that. I really respect the integrity of journalists where they say it's really important to be almost neutral, bordering on
Mm-hmm.
invisible when your work is being consumed by others. and there's kind of like it's like an ethical commitment in some ways to deliver like your work. But now it's fairly common and very understandably so for people to like write their work, and also like they have to promote it on TikTok or make sure to
Hmm.
share on X/Twitter and wherever else, and make sure you set up Blue Sky and almost being like an influencer slash like content creator alongside the good old skills that you trained on, right, in J
Yeah,
school.
for sure. Yeah, and they did not really teach us anything about that, and there was basically they're like Twitter was still fairly new because I'm old.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. They existed, but not in this way.
Yeah, so it was basically like, here's Twitter, you should maybe join it and think about it. But there wasn't a lot about like promoting your work. I have such, mixed feelings about it because like I think it is a way for some people from background who didn't go to J school and who don't have like a traditional journalism background to gain an audience. But I think also the algorithms favor pretty white, thin, young people, and if you don't fit in that, like it's harder to get your work out. And then it's also, if you're attaching your face to a lot of your work, you have to be prepared to get comments on your appearance. And it's like, I didn't really sign up to be like, hear a lot of strangers' thoughts on my body or my face when I went to J school. That's not something
No,
that I
like
thought about.
writers famously did not want to be in front of the camera,
Exact.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's something I struggle with because I'm like, I think I'm a good writer and editor, but I don't think I'm very good on camera. And like, I never trained out to be an actor or a newscaster or anything like that. Like, I
Yeah.
wanted to work with words and with writing, and
Hmm.
now it's like, oh, and now I have to like be on camera and in
Yeah.
photographs, and I'm not someone who loves doing that.
Even for this podcast, I've kept it mostly audio,
Yeah.
even though technically that wouldn't be like the advice given today, especially, right? But actually a huge part of it is because of the way I edit my work. And also it's not that I will hate being on camera, but I feel like it's such a distraction from the thing that I truly care about, which is like the conversational part.
Yeah.
And when you start having to worry about lighting and all of that, and I think there's just the focus is a little bit different. So I also struggle with that, and I'm having to navigate that myself as well, and hoping like, well, I don't know if the work can speak for itself in these days anymore. There's a lot happening.
Yeah, exactly.
Based on how you've navigated things so far, do you have any predictions or general sense of what the next decade might look like for the landscape of journalism or just for journalists in general and writers?
Yeah, and actually, I got drinks with a former coworker recently, and we were talking a lot about this. I think we're in a real kind of like inflection point moment right now, where if you look at kind of the history of journalism over the past 20 years or so, there's been a lot of like things are going well, and then there's some new technological change that makes it crash, and then it kind of re-stabilizes, probably not at the same point, but better than it was at the crash. And then it's there for a while, and then something else happens. So we're right now in a moment of, and I'm not sure how much people who aren't in the industry know this, but like over the past year or two, Google has been introducing a lot of really dramatic algorithm changes that are deprioritizing publishers and prioritizing social media sites, especially Reddit. And then, of course, there's like the AI overview and things too. So traffic is down for pretty much every publisher right now, which means they're all freaking out about revenue as well. So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think we're in a moment really similar to like when Facebook pivoted to video, turned off that source of publishing or that source of traffic for publishers, similar to like the dot-com boom and bust of like the early 2000s.
And going from print to digital,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah, yeah, that
seems
too.
settled, but this is even now is still kind of ongoing.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also like, I think definitely things are going in the digital direction, but I think publishers have still not really figured out how to reliably make the same amount of money
Yeah.
in digital as they used to in print,
Hmm.
which is a problem. So basically, I feel like we're in a very chaotic moment right now, and things are going to hopefully stabilize in the next couple of years as we figure out a new way to get traffic and get money. And a lot of the mistakes that publishers do is relying on one technology company
Mm-hmm.
when those technology companies don't have journalists' best interests at heart. It's not like they're anti-journalism, they're just like pro making money for themselves, and they don't really care too much about the press. Where if you're relying really heavily on Facebook or Google or X or Reddit, like if you're relying really heavily on one media plat or one technology for your traffic and your money, like the moment that technology changes, you're screwed. So I think everyone needs to be like diversifying their content, diversifying
Mm-hmm.
their streams of traffic, diversifying their revenue. So I think we're in a moment of like upheaval and chaos right now. And hopefully things will improve as people figure out new ways and try to think of new ways that aren't just like
Mm-hmm.
trying to do whatever Google wants you to do. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, I think it's funny you talk about the decrease in viewership, but
Mhm.
also at the same time, especially over the past decade, right, the increase in things like podcasts, in fact,
Yeah, yeah.
ironically, and just like rather than news, what people consume a lot more these days is commentators and pundits, and closer to the art of the personal essay or versus the skill that I think was once really heavily cultivated, especially in J school, the ethics around that. Making sure that your opinion is digested as such. But I suppose I will add, like, yeah, hopefully there are some discoveries and evolutions, which it's not really specifically about news, but like a lot of people are turning to Substack, which seems to be
Yeah.
things like that. And when you talk about diversifying skills, think about all the different avenues. And I know a lot of my friends have gone to Substack, started focusing on like social media and things like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I am hopefully going to be launching a Substack pretty soon as well. I've got one in the works.
Yeah. Let me know and I'll link it
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Hmm.
So yeah, it kind of pushes for evolution in that ways. And I do see writers, it's like, look, writing's not going anywhere. This art form, I guess I'll say,
Hmm.
is not going anywhere, but it definitely, the people are just having to do our best to navigate it, like you're saying, despite the inflection point. Do you have any particular like really memorable assignments or just like things that you got to experience because of your work as a journalist? Because I think there's like the sitting at the desk part, but as a
Yeah.
part of your work, you got to travel a lot and different types of writing look different.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely press trips are like the biggest perk of the job. And a press trip is when like usually a brand will bring you and some other journalists out to like experience whatever it is they're promoting, like a new hotel or like I went to Parma, Italy in a trip that was for the Parmigiano Reggiano Consortium. So like that was
Ooh.
to tour a dairy farm and eat a lot of cheese, which was delicious. Yeah, I've gotten to travel a lot, which has been a huge perk, and gotten to write about that travel in some ways that have been very fun. And when I was at Refinery 29, I went to Hedonism 2 in Jamaica, which is a like swingers nudist resort.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I got to write about that and experience that, and that was just like a very fun experience that is not something I ever would have encountered on my own.
Yeah, that actually somewhat close to the Carrie Bradshaw thing. You know that
Yeah.
joke about so many people move to the city because of Sex in the City.
Yeah, yeah,
But
and
you actually got to do some of the things that people were joking about, like how is she doing this in New York City? But you did it a little bit.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think journalism is so weird because there are some things you get to experience that are very fun and seemingly glamorous, but then it's also like a very low paid industry. So at the same time, I remember being in Egypt and preparing for a strike at the same time. So like, and I wrote like a social media post that was, this job lets me go to Egypt, and that's so amazing, and I'm so grateful for that. But I can't pay my rent with pictures of the pyramids. I still need money to pay my rent, pay my
Yeah,
groceries, pay for
right.
medical care, etc. Yeah, there's like the highs and then the lows at the same
Yeah,
time.
experiences and exposure cannot pay the bills, even though a lot of people are
Exactly.
like, I need that, right? And that's also true. So, yeah, thank you for sharing some of that. I think another thing that I would say about writing is that it was a way for me to work at a desk and be like an introvert, but still like
Hmm.
contribute to something. And then it kind of can branch off. You've also written a book, Astro Sex.
Yeah.
So that was happening as you were, working as a journalist. How did that come about, and how was that experience?
Yeah, it was like a really interesting experience, and I think it was not a super typical one. Basically, the publisher reached out to me, and this was in early 2020 and like the early days of the pandemic, where this publisher knew they wanted to put out a book on sex and astrology, and they were looking for a writer to collaborate with. So the publisher, like, they had the title, and they had kind of a rough idea of what they wanted it to include. So one of the editors reached out to me and was like, "Hey, we have this book project we want to work on, and we're looking for a writer for it."
Mm-hmm.
I eventually said yes, and then I worked with the editor to put together like a really detailed outline.
Yeah.
And she had some notes on that, and like we got that in shape, and then I wrote it in a month. Maybe it's a very short timeline. I think I started talking with the editor in, I think, April 2020, and then my first draft was due in July 2020.
That's
So
a
it was a
that's a
very
short turnaround. My goodness.
yeah, I remember that I had a chunk of time off for 4th of July, and I did the majority of the work
Mm-hmm.
that week.
Yeah.
So it was a very condensed timeline, and it was also the early stage of the pandemic when we were in lockdown. So I was kind
Yeah.
of like, this is a very short timeline, but like I got nothing else to do. Like I'm going on a masked walk alone every day, and then I have hours to go.
Right, right,
So,
right.
but yeah, the editor I worked with was great, and it was definitely an interesting experience to work on that side of publishing and see it all come together. And then also, the publisher is based in the UK, so I kind of the editor helped too, but kind of we Britishized it, and then eventually they decided to release a new version for American audiences. So then we had to re-Americanize
Oh
the
my
British
God.
version.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Something that like people wouldn't even think about, but yeah.
Yeah, it came out in 12 books in the UK, like one for each sign, and then in the US it came together in one book for all 12 signs.
Gotcha.
So we worked on kind of the British version, the American version, which for me as an American was like very interesting to see the
Yeah.
different ways it's marketed and comes together in each country.
That's awesome that you were approached, which is like most writers, people are preparing to try to get certain
Yeah,
companies attention and things like that, and they're usually going to them with things prepared. So that's like really interesting to hear.
yeah, and I think it's more common with like these nonfiction. They kind of call them gift books, which are like books that you would like give a friend
Mm,
for their birthday or for Christmas or something. So
right,
I
yeah.
have a few peers who have written similar projects and have also been approached by publishers to do it.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's definitely different from like someone who has like a passion project or a novel, and they are really trying to find a home for it.
Yeah, yeah.
A peer I talked to, or like a mentor, I had gone to her. I was like, should I do this project? And she was like, I think of these as like being kind of like an extra long magazine assignment. And that really helped me think about it in a similar way, where it's like you're getting kind of a similar collaborative experience with the editor and with the publisher.
Hmm.
But it's not like, this is the novel from my heart. It's
Yeah.
more similar to magazine writing than I think like fiction writing or novel writing.
And I think that's like so many ways that's how we started writing, or maybe like entered school, is that we quote unquote wrote from our heart, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I do think eventually you realize, at least I'll say this is my journey, which is that there's a different type of writing, which is writing on assignment to like you have a job to do. And I actually really did appreciate that, in addition to like, how do I protect my work that I really care about? And how do I, stay creative for my passion projects and things like that? But also, you don't have to be what we think conventionally as like a really elite writer in order to be published or paid or popular.
Yeah. And I think too, I think people kind of similar to like what we were saying with like the Carrie Bradshaw of it all. People think if you've published a book, you're like really wealthy. And that's not true. Like most books will pay like maybe a couple $1,000s, 10 or $15,000, but they're
For
not.
many, many hours, like
Yeah,
for,
yeah.
yeah.
And like, obviously that's money you didn't have before you wrote the book, but it's
Yeah.
not enough to live on its own.
This is not the same, but like I won a playwriting competition, and it was nice that I got to like pay rent for that 1 month with like money I made as a playwright.
Yeah.
But I had that play around for years, you know?
Yeah.
So um It's interesting to hear like both the tangible results that people get out of writing and also like the things that maybe made us be like hopeful and made us dream bigger as a writer. How do you balance between like assignments versus
Mhm.
like, oh, what if this is like something I really care about?
Yeah, it has really depended on where I am in my career. Like if I'm working, if I have a full-time job on staff somewhere or if I'm
Yeah.
freelance. I've had I had one teacher in college who said she does a like, two for you, one for me sort of thing. And I've heard a lot of people doing that. Right now where I'm at, where I'm freelancing, and I'm freelancing for the first time in like almost 5 years. Right now, I'm pitching like, this is a weird, fun idea and I want to write about. So I'm kind of taking a moment to be like, I'm just going to put out all my weirdest interests, see what comes. And then also being like, I'm open for assignments, people like get in touch. And I've gotten a few assignments that way where people are like, oh, I know you have experience with Astro. I know you have experience with sex relationships, and we need someone to write like this type of piece. But then other places, like when I was at Cosmo, the most of what I was writing, I would say probably like maybe like 85% of what I was writing was determined by kind of like content strategy needs, where at the start of the month I would have kind of like a list of keywords and topics to cover, and I could occasionally like throw something random in there too, or sometimes there would be a keyword or content strategy term and I'd be like, oh, this makes me think of this fun idea, let's do this in a new way. But most of what I was doing was determined by kind of like this content strategy planning, and not just like, this is a weird idea I have that I want to write about simply because I personally think it's interesting.
Right.
Sometimes
And how do you feel? Right. Yeah.
yeah, sometimes I could get some of those in there, and it's not like I could never. Sometimes I could, but it wasn't the main focus.
So do you have some that you still have in your back pocket? The idea is good. It just there hasn't been like an assignment or something that is suitable for it, but I'm gonna hang on to it and see what happens.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I have a lot of things like that where
Yeah,
I've
not that you
been
need to share, but like, I think that's fairly common to be like, I know I can't do it right now, but
yeah,
it doesn't mean I can't work on it later.
yeah,
That
for
kind of
sure.
thing.
Yeah. And now I'm starting to pitch more things. And then sometimes, like, maybe you'll pitch something, it'll be like, oh, this is good, but like, we can't do it right now. And then maybe like a year or two later, they'll be like, hey, remember that idea you had? And I'll be like, yes, I do.
Right. Yeah, you never know
um,
how how something can happen down the line. That's
yeah.
because of something you had written or shared way earlier. And that makes me think about like the art of pitching. Pitching and having to present your idea is something that I think writers get really hung up on, and like
Hmm.
we really worry about it as a skill set because it's not naturally tied to our writing skills. What do you think about is important in pitching?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say there's kind of two types of pitching for journalists, what you're talking about. Like, one is writing based, and as a freelancer, that's what I'm mostly doing right now, is where you're writing like 3, 5 paragraphs where you're kind of explaining the story you want to write and giving sample headlines and talking about what sources you'd use, talking about length, that sort of thing. But then I've also, as a staff editor, been in a lot of pitch meetings where you're pitching the lineup for the print magazine or for the monthly digital stories, where
Oh, yeah.
you have it written out, but then you're presenting it to like a team of
Right,
people
right, right.
who will have questions
Yeah.
and comments, and sometimes they'll be like, can you think of some new titles? And you have to be very quick on your feet right at that moment. So yeah, for that type, like, I think it is really important to be able to be flexible, which means really kind of over preparing, knowing everything you can about your pitch and kind of trying to anticipate some of the questions they might ask or suggestions they might have. And it also involves thinking about the story you're pitching in a wider context of like everything else the publisher is going to publish in that issue or that month, or and also like has published in that year. Like when I was at Bust magazine, I would often pitch something and they'd be like, oh no, we're not going to do that because we did it 5 years ago. So you have to like have backups for your backups, and you have to also know the context as much as you can.
So when you say over prepare, is really like try to anticipate the questions that you are probably most likely going to get. And also, if it's not an ideal pitch, that you have some other options as well.
Yeah, yeah, that you're able to pivot and that you have backups. When I first started pitching, especially at Cosmo, which was a bigger publisher than Bust, I was like terrified. And I would also, people would ask me questions and I'd be like, drama. But by the end, I was like, oh, I got this. This is chill
Yeah.
now.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think people should take comfort in that. Like, there are just some things that you just get used to it with time. At NYU, there is a skill that I still have with me, I think, which is just like everyone had to share their writing like every weekday
Yep.
and get immediate feedback, and you have to
Yes.
sit there. And there is something that has been so ingrained in me that I'm not triggered, I don't react the same way because of it. And I so appreciate it because it is really tough, but like if you have to do it every day, you're gonna get comfortable regardless, you know.
Yeah, for sure. What one thing I notice with a lot of new journalists is they are personally hurt by getting
Right.
edited, and they don't really know how to take edits. And I think that is a really important skill to have, is to learn how to hear constructive criticism
Mm-hmm.
and take it in, and also to understand that, like, as a journalist, a lot of changes editors will make to your piece, it's not necessarily because your version was bad, it's because they need to fit like their own house style guide, which might be a different voice from what you naturally write with. And it doesn't mean like your voice is bad, it just means that like they're adjusting to fit in what their needs are.
Yeah, absolutely. Relationship to an editor could be another whole other discussion, but
Yeah.
you're right. Getting feedback and editing and pitching, I think those are all skill sets that go hand in hand with writing as well,
Yeah.
and certainly in journalism. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be like, this is something you could learn in college, but you don't have to learn it in college. You can learn it
No.
from having friends, peers who have the skills you want, like be honest and give you feedback. Like, I'm like, don't spend your money on J school, everyone. Don't do it.
No,
Like,
as someone who
there
went
are other
to
ways.
school to learn like script writing and things like that, I 100% agree with you. I can say now, having had the experience, a really important skill is to be able to bring people together, organizing readings and things like that. But you can absolutely replicate that experience. Just takes effort, I think. If you have a really
Yeah.
good quote unquote writers group, formal, informal, what have you, it can be like lightning in a bottle. And sometimes
Mhm.
it's like finding the right group and things like that. You've done some ghostwriting as well. So I think that's coming from like script writing and also people who write like books, right? Like this is your
Yeah.
baby. This is something that I feel like don't get discussed with passion, right?
Yeah.
But it is a legitimate way to support yourself and to develop your career. So any thoughts and perspectives you want to share about ghostwriting, especially how to approach it, how to best navigate a particular type of writing environment?
Yeah, I think the ghostwriting I've done, I think of it as really similar to a type of magazine writing called As Told Twos, which is basically like when you interview someone and then you kind of turn their interview into a first person story that where you're using like I to refer to them. Often they'll like have input on the final version to like make sure that like they agree. They say the words, you construct the words into like a more polished narrative, and then they
Yeah.
approve it.
Oh, people have definitely
Uh,
read it. You've
yeah,
read those
yeah,
profiles for
yeah,
sure. They're
yeah, yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of, I think that's fairly common in magazine type writing. So with ghostwriting, I kind of thought of that as a bigger version of that, where I had access to the person's spoken words, and then I kind of used them to put together a narrative, and they like approved, had notes, etc. on the final. So yeah, I think of it as magazine writing like supercharged, where it is a different type of writing that is really interesting and fun to work with, where you have spoken words that you're then reconstituting to fit a more polished narrative. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that like anything is fake or anything. Like, you will likely edit this podcast to make it a little more polished so
Hmm.
people aren't hearing me like cough all the time.
Or my cats.
Yeah,
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 exactly.
exactly. Like, it's just like turning a conversation, or like a spoken
Yeah.
monologue, whatever, into like a more polished written work.
Also like taking one project or idea and transforming it into a different medium, a
Yes, for
different
sure.
form for sure. There's going to be aspects of doing research, getting to understand the subject or the project, right?
Yes, for sure.
Translating that into a piece of work is kind of what
Mhm.
you did as a ghostwriter. because the stakes are different as a ghostwriter, I think in
Mhm.
some ways that could be really desirable.
Yeah, I think it can be kind of fun because it's like my name's not on there. Like I'm a ghost. Like obviously, I want the piece to be good and I want the person to
Yeah.
be pleased with the final project, but like it's not my name on the line.
And you can let it go at once it's done, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's sometimes really important, but it can be really challenging to be like every project is your blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
it's a lot to go through that. There are so many different ways to work as a writer and to be a writer and to keep writing that is outside of what it traditionally looks like to people,
Yeah.
right? Especially as things continue to evolve with technology and the internet and AI and
Mhm.
everything. So you never know what could happen in the future. But if there's anything else that are there other things that you want to share with people, especially for people who are maybe, who are writers at heart,
Mhm.
but similarly are dealing with very difficult realities at the same time, and
Yeah,
we recognize that. And yet, I think people have a lot to say about why we can persevere. I'm just curious what you have to say about continuing to persevere as writers and artists.
definitely agree that it is like a really hard time for a lot of people right now. And this is kind of like goes into what we were talking about, like the writers, influencer, etc., is realizing that most people are also really struggling right now. You're not doing something wrong, you're not bad at your work. It's just it's a really hard moment in a really hard industry right now. Record numbers of people are being laid off. I was laid off in November. People who have been freelancers for decades are having their worst years ever. The economic reality of the industry and just of like the country and the world right now is really bad. And it's not because you're a bad writer, if you're not able to place things and not able to get a job right now. And this is like something I talk a lot about with a lot of my friends who work in creative industries. There's like your passion, your interest, and then there's like the way you make money. And a lot of times those don't intersect. And sometimes they intersect a little bit. Like if, you know, like we were talking about the many different types of writing, like technical writing or ghostwriting or taking freelance,
Copywriting,
yeah,
yeah.
copywriting, taking freelance assignments that are on, you know, subjects that like I'm happy to write about for money, but are not like the passion of my heart. So sometimes they intersect in some ways, but like I also know people who are really, really wonderful writers and who have a day job or who's, you know, supplement their income with bartending, childcare, or some other kind of service industry job. A lot of times talent and money have nothing to do with each other.
I think there are both people might feel disillusioned by that, but I also think there are aspects of hope about it too, meaning
Yeah.
there are certain barriers and gates that have been kept close to us, so we thought, that has nothing to do with excellence or how much training, integrity, and things like that. In some ways, for aspiring writers or people who are just trying to cultivate a life around writing,
Mhm.
there are certain barriers like access and how much money you spent training that does not necessarily have to determine the future. I think there are aspects of the market that can be liberating in some ways because the way we assess the market is so fundamentally different now,
Mhm.
and what works and doesn't work. So hopefully there's some possibility as well. Obviously, we talk to each other frequently outside the podcast. It's really like motivating to see people navigating really hard times and knowing that you're not alone in all of that.
Mhm.
So where can people find some of your existing writing if they want to see some of your coverage and beats and things like that, in addition to the book
Mhm.
Astrosex, which you can find online?
Yeah, so I've been on staff at Cosmo, Refinery 29, and Bust, so I have long archives there. I am in my freelancing era right now, where I've published three freelance pieces. I have a couple more in the works that should be coming out in the next couple weeks. Those I'm sharing on social media, which is at Erika, Erika, Wynn, Wynn. I have that on like every platform. And then my website is erikawsmith.com, which is where my some of my clips are and how to contact me and stuff like that.
We'll see what happens, but I do
Yeah.
think there will be lots more writing. I have a feeling. So, okay, well, I didn't want to skip any questions. We didn't really talk about pop culture too much. Like 2 seconds, biggest takeaways from the Oscars.
Oh, you mean the Golden Globes
I'm
or?
sorry, Golden
Yeah,
Globes.
yeah. I think people forget, and part of it is because I think they did actually like have a good host and a better ceremony this year.
Hmm.
But like the Golden Globes are a really weird, or like a weird award award show that doesn't necessarily coincide with the way other award shows work, where like, do you remember this whole controversy when Emily in Paris won
Hmm.
a bunch of Golden Globes, and it turned out because it was a really small voting body and Netflix had like given them all free vacations to Paris. I know people are really upset about like Amelia Perez winning, and there are also, I think, just some other like kind of random wins in there. So I don't know if the Golden Globes are necessarily going to like predict the rest of award season.
Yeah, which usually they do, but I feel like there's rumblings of like it's gonna be kind of all over the place, which is pretty unusual.
Yeah. I think Golden Globes is less predictive than like a lot of the other award season things, like the Independent Spirit Awards and things like that. But yeah, I love watching awards season, and I've seen a lot of the movies. I'm trying to see all of the movies. I still have a few to go. It'll be interesting to see who wins. I'm like,
Yeah,
yeah, and I'm rooting for challengers to win everything. I love that movie.
I'm rooting. I would like Wicked to win some. I
Yeah,
know that's
I
like a
really
very
like.
popular
No, I liked
sentiment, but
it.
you
I liked
know,
Wicked a lot too. I thought they did a great job.
I think people forget the voting, but like how these decisions are made is not like general elections or something, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, for sure.
It's not a reflection of the country or something like that. So it's
Yeah,
really
it
funny
really
the discourse
depends.
that comes from it. I'm also very pro celebrity lookalike showing up to these award shows. I
Mhm,
think that is
mhm.
hilarious. It will make it more camp. Whatever this phenomenon of celebrity lookalike contest, I'm very in support of it.
Yeah, I think it's really kind of silly and fun in a way that I'm enjoying. I haven't attended any.
I can see you doing that red carpet coverage.
Yeah, I in my early career I did a lot of red carpet coverage, like a lot of those short little interviews with people,
Yeah.
um, which was hard, but
Yeah, I would find them tough.
interesting and fun, because a lot of it is just getting at people's attention, where
Yeah.
you have to just be like, over here, talk to me, and then they'll give you like 30 seconds. So it's a lot of like first trying to get people's attention and then trying to get your questions out very quickly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sounds very highly stimulating, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, yeah, definitely very like overwhelming, but also really interesting to see how it works on that side of things. So yeah, in my early career, when I was doing a lot of like celebrity fashion coverage, I would be doing that and be going like, tell me about what you're wearing. Tell me what your favorite trend is for spring.
Do you have a dream person that you want to do like a sit down one-on-one
Mm.
interview with?
That's a good question. I feel like it would be have to be someone who I've been like a fangirl of for a very long time. So like
Mm,
someone like Connor Oberst from Bright Eyes. I ran a Bright Eyes
because
fan
you have
blog.
questions, don't
I
you?
I have questions. I have many questions. I ran a Bright Eyes fan blog in college, so I feel like I am like a Bright Eyes expert. Yeah, I would love to interview him. I feel like a lot of musicians I get very fangirly about. Like I was supposed to interview Mitski during her Be the Cowboy tour, but she had canceled like a whole lot of scheduled interviews. Be more selective about who she was interviewing with. She's kind of like the one who got away, where I was supposed to have like
That would
a
have been cool.
like a really big interview with her, and it got killed.
Oh yeah, I can see you doing that. Let's manifest variety of things. But
Yeah, exactly.
press coverage, concert coverage.
Yeah,
I was like, hey, you got to
yeah,
go to concerts. So there you go.
exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for your time today. And hopefully you can do more of this and we have a much more busy year as writers.
We're speaking it into existence.
Exactly.